The Forgotten Army that won World War II's most impossible campaign. Imagine fighting a war where the jungle itself wants to kill you, where monsoon rains fall so hard you cannot see the man standing 2 feet in front of you, where malaria, dysentery, and typhus claim more lives than enemy bullets, where your supply line is a single dirt road carved through mountains so steep that mules fall off the edge and disappear into the mist below. Now imagine doing all of that and winning. And then imagine that when the war was over, nobody talked about it. No parades, no headlines, no Hollywood films. Your sacrifices buried beneath the glory of campaigns fought on the other side of the world. This is the story of the British 14th Army. 1 million soldiers from over 50 nations, fighting in conditions so brutal that veterans simply called it the Forgotten War. But here is what history got wrong. These men did not just survive the impossible. They conquered it. Stay with me, because what these soldiers achieved in the jungles and mountains of Burma between 1942 and 1945 is one of the most extraordinary military feats in all of human history. And it is time the world finally heard their story. To understand why this army was forgotten, you first need to understand the world in 1941. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In the same week, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore in rapid succession. It was one of the greatest military humiliations in British history. Over 80,000 Allied soldiers surrendered at Singapore alone. Winston Churchill called it, quote, "the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history." Then came Burma. Japan wanted Burma for 3 reasons. First, it cut off the Burma Road, the crucial supply line delivering weapons and fuel to China's nationalist forces. Second, it gave Japan a defensive wall of jungle and mountains shielding their Pacific empire. Third, and most provocatively, it put Japanese soldiers on the doorstep of India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. In early 1942, British and Indian forces were pushed into one of the longest retreats in military history, nearly 1,000 miles on foot through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Soldiers who survived described mountains that never ended, rivers that ran red with blood, and a jungle so dense and dark it felt like the world had no sky. By the time the dust settled, Britain had suffered its worst military defeat since the American Revolution. The army that limped out of Burma was broken, exhausted, and humiliated. And that is where our story truly begins. Now, here is something important that many people miss. The 14th Army was not just called Forgotten because of what happened after the war. They were being forgotten in real time, while they were still fighting. In December 1941, Britain and the United States made a critical strategic decision. Europe first. The defeat of Nazi Germany would be the priority. All resources, all press coverage, all political attention would flow westward. What this meant in practice was devastating. The soldiers in Burma received outdated weapons, rations that arrived late or not at all, medical supplies that ran dry in the middle of epidemics. Letters from home took so long to arrive, if they arrived at all, that soldiers joked their families had probably forgotten they existed. The British press focused on the drama unfolding in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy, gave Burma almost no coverage. Soldiers would read newspapers from home and find not a single mention of the campaign they were fighting and dying in. One soldier wrote to his wife, "We have begun to wonder if England knows we are here, or if England cares." And then there was Churchill. Historical evidence suggests that Winston Churchill, for all his genius as a wartime leader, repeatedly downplayed the Indian Army's achievements. He rarely acknowledged the victories at Kohima and Imphal in 1944, battles that historians now rank among the most decisive of the entire Second World War. He barely mentioned them in his own 6-volume war memoirs. For the soldiers who fought them, this was not just oversight. It felt like erasure. So, who were these men? The British 14th Army was arguably the most diverse fighting force in human history. At its peak, it comprised roughly 1 million soldiers. But calling it a British Army is almost misleading. There were soldiers from the British Indian Army, drawn from regiments with centuries of tradition. Gurkhas from Nepal, warriors so formidable that even their enemies respected them. East Africans from the 11th East African Division, men who had never seen a jungle before and became masters of it. Soldiers from West Africa, from Burma itself, native resistance fighters who knew every trail, every river crossing, every ambush point.
And threading through all of them, British officers working alongside Indian officers in a command structure that was, for its time, remarkably integrated. What held this extraordinary patchwork of humanity together was a single man, General William Slim. If you have never heard of William Slim, you are not alone. He remains one of the least celebrated great commanders of the Second World War. No Hollywood films, no dramatic biopics. And yet Admiral Lord Mountbatten, who had every reason to be generous with his own reputation, called Slim, quote, the finest general World War II produced. When Slim took command of what would become the 14th Army, he inherited a shattered force, demoralized, defeated. Many of his men believed the Japanese soldier was some kind of superhuman jungle fighter who could not be beaten. Slim set about dismantling that myth with brutal precision. He told his soldiers, "The Japanese are not Superman. They are human beings, subject to the same fears, the same hunger, the same exhaustion as you. The difference is that they believe they are unbeatable. Our job is to prove them wrong." He reformed training. He redesigned tactics. He solved the supply problem that had crippled every previous campaign, eventually convincing the Allied High Command to use airdrops to supply his men in the field, something that had never been attempted on this scale before. Most importantly, he walked among his soldiers, not behind the lines, among them, in the mud and the rain, sharing their rations, listening to their problems, learning their names. The men of the 14th Army did not just respect Slim, they loved him. Before we reach the battles, you need to understand what these soldiers were up against every single day before a single shot was fired. Burma is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The jungle canopy is so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Visibility can drop to 10 feet. In that darkness, live creatures that seem designed by nature to kill. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes, venomous snakes, leeches that attach to every inch of exposed skin. Monsoon rains turn rivers into roaring floods overnight and transform trails into rivers of mud so deep that men have sunk and been lost in them. The Arakan Yoma's mountain range stretches like a spine down western Burma, peaks reaching 10,000 feet. Moving artillery and supply convoys through it was considered by military planners to be, in their own words, technically impossible. And then there was disease. In the early years of the Burma campaign, for every soldier wounded in combat, 120 were struck down by disease. Malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, cholera. At one point, the 14th Army was losing more men to sickness in a single week than to Japanese bullets in a month. Slim recognized this was an existential threat. He launched one of the most aggressive military health campaigns in history, making anti-malarial discipline mandatory, punishable by the same standards as abandoning your post in battle. The result was astonishing. By 1944, disease casualties had fallen by over 90%. That single medical achievement may have won the war in Burma before a major battle was even fought. And still the Japanese waited. Let us be clear about the enemy the 14th Army faced. The Imperial Japanese Army in Burma was not a broken, retreating force. It was the same army that had humiliated British forces in 1942. Fanatically disciplined, masters of jungle warfare, fighting under a code that made surrender unthinkable. Japanese soldiers were prepared, even expected, to die rather than yield a single inch of ground.
Facing this enemy, in this terrain, with these supply problems, many considered the reconquest of Burma to be a military impossibility. In March 1944, Japan launched Operation Yugo. Its objective was audacious: invade India itself, spark a nationalist uprising against British rule, and knock Britain out of the war in Asia in a single blow. The spearhead of the Japanese advance drove toward two small towns that most people in Britain had never heard of: Kohima and Imphal. Kohima was a tiny hill town in the Naga Hills of northeastern India, the size of a small village. Its garrison, when the Japanese arrived, numbered fewer than 1,500 men. The Japanese force attacking it numbered over 13,000. What followed was one of the most savage close-quarters battles of the entire war. The fighting was so intense, the distances so small, that at one point British and Japanese soldiers were throwing grenades at each other across a tennis court on the grounds of the district commissioner's bungalow. That tennis court became one of the most iconic landmarks of the Burma campaign, a place where two armies literally faced each other across a line you could cross in 3 steps. For weeks, the garrison held. Resupplied only by air, fighting hand to hand, the defenders of Kohima refused to break. When relief finally arrived, it came like a battering ram, the British and Indian forces of the 2nd Division smashing through the Japanese encirclement in brutal fighting that lasted weeks more. Meanwhile, at Imphal, a similar drama was playing out on a massive scale. The Japanese surrounded the entire Imphal plain, cutting it off by land.
Again, the Allied forces held. Again, supplied entirely from the air. Again, through weeks of merciless fighting. When the Japanese finally broke and retreated, they left behind over 50,000 dead. It was the greatest defeat ever suffered by the Imperial Japanese Army in its entire history. Historian Lewis Allen called Kohima and Imphal, quote, the turning point of the war in Asia. In Britain, these battles received barely a paragraph in the national press. The landings at Normandy had happened the same summer. The world was looking west. The forgotten army had just won the greatest land battle of the Pacific War. Nobody noticed. After Kohima and Imphal, the 14th Army did something that shocked even its own commanders. They pursued the retreating Japanese into Burma. This was not supposed to be possible. You do not advance an army of 1 million men across mountain ranges and river valleys in monsoon season. Military doctrine said you consolidate, you rest, you resupply, you plan. You do not chase a broken enemy into one of the most hostile places on Earth. Slim did it anyway. The advance into Burma was a logistical miracle that has never received the attention it deserves. Slim's engineers built roads across mountains. His supply teams coordinated the largest sustained air resupply operation in history up to that point. His commanders adapted tactics on the fly, using speed and flexibility to keep the Japanese off balance before they could recover and reform. The Battle of Meiktila and Mandalay in early 1945 was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Slim sent one force to pin the Japanese at Mandalay, Burma's ancient royal capital and the obvious objective. Then, while the enemy's attention was fixed there, he sent an armored column on a wide flanking maneuver to Meiktila, deep in the Japanese rear, where their main supply depot was located. When Meiktila fell, the entire Japanese defensive line in central Burma collapsed. The Japanese garrison at Mandalay, cut off from supplies, fought with desperate ferocity, but could not hold. On March 20th, 1945, Mandalay fell to the 14th Army. 3 months later, on May 3, 1945, Rangoon, the capital of Burma, was liberated. The Burma campaign was over. The 14th Army had done what everyone said could not be done. The men of the 14th Army came home to a world that was already moving on. The victory in Europe dominated the celebrations. Japan's surrender came just months after Rangoon, and suddenly the entire war was over. There was no time, no appetite, no political will to sit down and honor 1 million soldiers who had fought in a place most British people could not find on a map. Within 2 years, both India and Burma had gained independence from Britain. The empire these soldiers had fought to defend was gone. The political narrative had shifted. Honoring their sacrifice meant revisiting a chapter of colonial history that the new post-war world was trying to close. And so the silence continued. The veterans of the 14th Army formed their own associations, wrote their own histories, told their own stories to anyone who would listen. For decades, those stories circulated mainly among themselves and their families.
General Slim eventually received his due recognition, rising to become Field Marshal and Governor-General of Australia. But his campaign never entered the mainstream consciousness of the war the way North Africa or the Western Front did. The Gurkha veterans, the East African soldiers, the Indian Army men who formed the bulk of the 14th Army, many returned to homelands that were themselves undergoing revolution and upheaval. Their service was not commemorated. In many cases, it was not even acknowledged. So why does this matter today? Because history is not just about facts, it is about who we choose to remember. The men of the 14th Army did not fight for headlines. They did not fight for parades. Many of them could not even read the newspapers that were ignoring them. They fought because they were soldiers, because they believed in something, and because the man next to them was fighting, and they were not going to leave him alone. They faced a campaign that military planners called impossible. They were given fewer resources than any comparable Allied force in the war. They fought in conditions that defied human endurance. They defeated an enemy that had humiliated their predecessors. They liberated an entire country. And they did it without the world watching. There is a memorial to the Battle of Kohima. Carved in stone, it carries an inscription that has become one of the most moving epitaphs of the Second World War. It reads, "When you go home, tell them of us, and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." 1 million soldiers, 50 nations, 3 years of jungle warfare, one impossible victory. They were the forgotten army, and they won World War II's most impossible campaign. It is time we remembered them.